So we're going to strategically dig out of that inventory crisis with Ben Mathis and have him answer all our questions of how to get involved in the different ways to a successful new construction building relationship business. So Ben Mathis, we go way, way back. I know he looks so young, but Ben has experienced 30 plus years in residential real estate. I say 30 plus because, well, why should we age either one of us? And it just seemed fair. Way back in the womb, Ben started in residential real estate, has been, some of you may know Ben from coaching, real estate coaching back in the day, and he has grown up and transitioned into a leadership role with Gray Wolf, new construction land development company, was there for about 3 years and took that company, and this is why you're here today, from 30 units and about 12 million in sales to 300 units and over 1,000 lots developed for future use. So a master at his game. Has recently transitioned out of that and currently owns Rock Tower Partners for land development and acquisition. And on the side, it does some large consulting projects with our builder developers out there called Oakwood Consulting Group. So Ben is very well versed in our topic today and an all-around great guy, great friend. Glad to call him my friend. And so we're going to turn it over to Ben to do any additional introductions that he would like to do and kick us off. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Debbie. Such nice things said about me. I'm not used to that. So as you all know, or probably know, some of you I know from my past coaching life that I did a few years back. Debbie hit all my high points. My background is heavily in residential real estate, and then transitioned somewhat slowly, but then it was pretty quick into new construction and land development. And that's what we're going to dig into heavily today. I think some of the big topics we'll cover is a quick overview of like the land development outline. My disclaimer whenever I consult or give these kind of talks is that it's different in every area, in every municipality. There's little nuances, but the overall framework stays the same of how these projects advance. We'll talk through some of the key people that you need on y'all's team. And then we'll talk specifically about new construction and what you guys can be doing to gain builder partners and have people on your team. One last thing I'll add, and then I'll let Debbie steer the ship on where she wants me to blab on for the next little bit, is throughout today, I'm a big conversation person and I'm very needy, if you guys don't know me. So I really need interaction. I like questions. And I'll also say this with land development, there's no dumb questions. I promise you guys, I have stories of some super stupid questions that I asked throughout my time in the land development, learning the whole process in a new construction. And I'm going to go really fast. I talk really fast. I process things really fast. So don't be afraid to throw a question in the chat box for anything that you guys may hear or you want to know more about. As Debbie and I talked through this a little bit prior to today, I can go as deep as you want me to go on these topics or as shallow as you want me to go on these topics. So it's really up to you guys that if you want to key in on something, now is your opportunity. I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you guys may have, but I would request that as we're going through today, please add any comments or questions into the chat box, because again, I am a little bit needy on that side of things. So I like to know that I'm being listened to. Debbie, where do you jump in?
Yeah, I think we kick it off right there. So land development and acquisitions, new construction opportunities. Would love to hear from any of you in the chat box, just so I know that you're here, even though I can't see some of you. Would love to hear maybe one thing that you would like to get out of today's experience. Just throw that in the chat box so we can see that you are ready to rock and roll, and two, so that we know that Ben is answering those questions that are important to you. And like he said, I love engagement too. All of you know that about me. So we'll kick it off. All right, so take just a second. One thing you'd like to take away from today's class, just based on the title.
Debbie, while they're doing that,
yeah,
you want to just touch on why new construction is important? We can talk about that for a second while they're warming up and getting us some questions.
I love it. Yep, let's take it away.
So I think everyone here knows this message, and I'm a big fan of data. So I'm always behind the scenes trying to figure out the different data endpoints. And one of the major statistics that we keep hearing tossed around is the shortage of inventory, right? And depending on your source, the United States as a whole, the numbers floated out there are typically between 1.5 million units short in terms of housing, upwards, some estimates are in like the 7 million range, right? So uh, right now, new construction is kind of having its day in the sun. Back in 2019, the new construction market share across the country was between 10 and 12%. As of 2024, that number's jumped to 30 to 40% of the market share. And if you Fannie Mae recently released a white paper study on the lockup of interest rates. And a lot of people say, well, once the interest rate comes down, all this inventory is going to be unloaded on the market, right? Well, they looked at, well, what's the gap or the delta between where someone's interest rate is at currently, right? And then the current interest rate of the market. So say you have a 3% interest rate and the rates are at 7%. They notice that for every 1% increase in the interest rate from your base rate, you were 18% less likely to put your house on the market based on the study that they just finished. I think this was published back in March of this year. So by the time you get up to the 7% range, it's an 87% likelihood you're not putting your house on the market, right? Even if you get it down to a 6%, you're still at about a 47% likelihood you're not going to put it on the market. So they estimated that for the resale inventory to come back, it's going to take around 10 to 15 years. And that's on a very linear timeline. They don't believe that we're going to see anything minimum within the next 5 to 7 years from the resale market. So all that being said, new construction is obviously here to stay, and it's going to be a big part of the market at least for the next decade, and most likely beyond that, just based on the current housing shortage. So I say that to say everything we talk about today is very applicable, not just as a way for you to grow your listing inventory, but I think that it's going to be very applicable for real estate agents to take over some market share in areas that a lot of people aren't paying attention to right now within the entire real estate sphere. So that's my setup for the new construction and why it's important.
That's great. And we did have some notes in here just to make sure that we cover in your presentation today. What are the key features of land when you look for investing? Who are the key players you need to have on your team? Best ways to find land and have the owner work with you as the agent so it doesn't go to a different company or farmer sells it to farmer type of deal. So would love to dive into the nuts and bolts of land development and even the acquisition piece. So I'll let you pick where we start with that, because some of these questions lend itself to that part of your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So we can talk about the land development kind of sequence as a whole. Throw in the chat box real quick if you guys would. Who here roughly knows what the sequence is to take a raw piece of dirt and turn it into a buildable lot? Is this something that a lot of you guys have experienced or not? And we'll walk through that sequence. I'm just trying to judge, should I go super fast on this or should I go at a moderate pace?
I think moderate, Ben, because if you ask me that question, I'd say raw piece of land, find a builder, let them do all the work, and hope and pray that I get paid at the end and they let me list that house that they put on the market.
Right. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. So this is actually going to hit one of the questions right off the bat. So sourcing land and lots, right? So there's two different ways for you to source lots for builders or for yourself as agents. We'll start with lots because that's somewhat easier to grasp right off the bat, and then we'll back into land, and then we'll walk through the whole land development process. And I'll hit the high points on it. And if there's a point where you guys have a question or want more details, just again, throw it in the chat box, raise your hand, yell at Debbie or something. So lots, you have subdivision lots, right? We call them VDLs, vacant developed lots. That's what that stands for. So VDLs basically are a build ready lot. Now you can find these from developers who are developing lots. And they're typically, several different types of developers. You have large developers, national companies. One of the most well-known ones would probably be Four-Star. They're a subsidiary. They're owned, I think, 75% by D.R. Horton. So they are one of the bigger developers because they have, I think, like $900 million that they develop with. And then you have your smaller local developers. There's a big range of developers, right? And really what that comes down to is capital. So you can go straight to one of these developers and say, hey, do you have any VDLs available that I could potentially sell to one of my builders or make a connection to a builder, right? And those subdivisions can be anywhere from a 10 lot, small minor subdivision, all the way up to like a 1,500 master plan community, big range of lots. So you could go that route and find VDLs from a developer. The other thing you can do is you can find what we call scatter lots. And that's where you have certain developments that maybe it was a 60 lot community and they sold it to 4 different builders and there's 4 or 5 lots that didn't get built on and they got forgotten about. Doesn't happen a ton. However, there are lots floating out there where people, you can pick up 4 or 5 lots for a builder, or maybe someone bought the lot next door and they were like, I may build on it in the future, and then they don't build on it, and it's just a blank lot that's sitting there. Those are build ready lots that you can go get today, right? That's one way you can go source lots for yourself. The other way is finding the land itself. And this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced. So the biggest thing that we look for, I think one of the questions, the key features of land that you look for when you're investing, we look at usable acreage versus total acreage. So I'm gonna give you three quick points: usable acreage versus total acreage. And this is a key differentiator that a lot of landowners, as well as agents who don't deal with land on a consistent basis, miss. You can have a 100-acre tract of land, right? 100 acres, it can be mostly farmland. A lot of it's flat, a lot of it looks usable. But in reality, if you're in a septic area where you have to use septic fields, the soils may not make that full tract of land usable. So then what we as a developer look at is we say, well, I have 100 acres here. I know I'm going to lose about 30% of it to right-of-ways, to storm drainage, culverts, drain pipes, right? So that 100 acres is now 70 usable acres. Out of that 70 acres, how many lots can I get? And a lot of things will inhibit the usable acreage on the whole deal. It'll be anything from the topography, the soils, different pieces of the puzzle like that will inhibit how many acres are actually usable. So the first thing I'm always looking at is usable versus total acreage. The second thing, and it's really three sub things. It's water, as in where does all the water go? That's one of the most important things. And you can just look at a contour map on GIS. GIS is one of the tools that we were going to suggest you guys use if you haven't used it. So water's first, soils are second. Soils are important not just for septic subdivisions. They're important because certain types of soils you can build on and certain you cannot. Now, this sounds like a lot, and you're like, whoa, how am I supposed to, I'm not a soil scientist. I don't know where I'm supposed to figure out which ones I can use or not use. Every county has something called a soil survey. It's online, it's public information. It's really boring. It's like a 200-page document that somebody put together. But in the back of that document, it tells you which type of soils are buildable and not buildable. It also tells you which type of soils are good for septics and not good for septics. And that's just a general tool you can use. If you go further in land development process, which we'll talk about in a minute, you would need to do a more in-depth study of the soils. But off the bat, you can see pretty quickly on GIS what the soils look like. And the last thing you're looking at is utilities. So you're trying to see, does this have water? Does this have sewer? Does it have access to those two things? And again, GIS is the best tool for this. Some counties, some cities don't publish their water information because back in 2001 with 9/11 happening, they got worried about terrorist attacks on the water supply. So some counties publish that information, some do not, but you can always call down in the municipality and see where they'll tell you basically where they're at, or they'll give you a map if you ask for it. So usable acreage versus total acreage, water runoff on the site, which is topography, soils, utilities, and the very last thing I'm looking at is lot yield. How many lots can I get out of this site? Because again, we're looking at this not from a commercial aspect, we're looking at it from a residential development aspect to get you guys lots that you can turn into listings later on. Does that make sense? So lot yield is a pretty simple calculation. Again, it's at 30%. We usually allocate 30% of your acreage to roadways, drainage, sidewalks, trees, whatever it may be, open space requirements. And then from there, you're centering in on, okay, out of that 100 acres, I have 70 that's usable now because I've got all my roadways, all the different things accounted for in the subdivision. And that's where you look at the runoff and the contours and say, how much of this acreage is actually usable? What do the soils tell me? Okay, now 50 acres are buildable. And then you have to also know your zoning for the area and say, okay, this area allows me to build 15,000 square foot lots or 5,000 square foot lots. And all of that information is in something called the Unified Development Ordinance. Every city, municipality, county has one of these. It's commonly referred to as the UDO. I'm going to stop there and let any questions happen, or if you guys have any questions, we can pause there for a second.
Just real quick on the UDO, that's something that we can find online for most counties across the states? Okay.
Yes. And
That's
most
really
of the
good.
counties and cities in North Carolina have done a good job of putting that online, and they use a system now that makes it more searchable and usable. It used to be really hard to find, and then if you did find it, finding the most updated version of it. Now they're doing a pretty good job of uploading them to a website and linked on the government's pages. So whatever your local government page is or website is, they'll typically have a link underneath the land planning section to their UDO.
So two free opportunities for tools there to dig into land with the GIS and UDO. And then I love how you said water, because I immediately thought, yeah, we need to know if it has water, right? Water, septic, or sewer, but the water runoff. So looking at that contour map, that was
The water runoff is honestly one of the biggest things we run into in terms of development. Whether you think about it or not, we're always concerned about what they call erosion control and then stormwater. So where does all this water flow? Who is it impacting? Is it going to cause flooding on a neighbor property? If you're in an environmentally sensitive district, are you going to hurt the river basins? They really look at water runoff as one of the primary things. And that's why in the permitting process, you typically have erosion control permits and then stormwater permits. But then if you have wetlands, or I know, Debbie, you're down towards the beach, so you deal with wetlands quite a bit. There's a whole separate Army Corps process where you have to deal with the state. And the state will issue what they call 401 or 404 permits if you're impacting wetlands. So really all they're looking at is, where's your water runoff going? Are you accounting for it? Are you polluting any of the natural areas or harming any endangered species or things of that nature? So water is actually one of the bigger things to look at. And if you could just look at your topography of your site, you can make a pretty good guess of where the water is running, where it's flowing, if you're going to have creek crossings or wetland disturbances.
Right. Adam chimed in. Adam Nicholas says, in North Carolina, what is a contour? What is a contour? You're referring there to the GIS contour map, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So you can toggle that on and off on most GISs where they show you the elevation. So you can have 2 foot, 4 foot, 10 foot, 20 foot contours, and you can see basically what a site looks like in terms of its slope and the height of the site, essentially.
Great. Any other quick questions? Good. All right.
So once you get all that figured out, that's your starting point. Now I'm gonna detour really quickly and talk about the team. I think somebody asked about key players, and that's one of the things we were going to mention. So at this point, if I feel pretty good about a site and I'm like, it hits all my boxes, I think, for example, on our 100-acre tract that we're using as a sample today, that's farmland. And I think I can get between 50 and 60 lots out of that, because I'm working in a septic community where I have to have, 1 acre lots based on my county restrictions. So at that point, what I'm going to do is reach out to an engineer, civil engineer, and depending on the size of the site, depending on the location of the site, I'll have different engineers that I talk with. But most of the time you can reach out and say, hey, I'm looking at this tract of land for a subdivision development. I think it's going to get this many lots out of it. Can you tell me really quickly what you think it can do? And most of these guys know their area really well, and they will quickly respond to you. Now, the key here is, if you consistently go to an engineer and they never get any work from you or from anybody that you eventually sell the development to, or say you sell the land to somebody and they don't use that person, they may not answer you if you don't use them for some purpose. But most of the time, they're not going to charge you on the front end to at least take a look at the site. The second person that I typically send all of my sites to would be my soil scientist. Soil scientists are invaluable, whether you're doing septic fields or not. They can look at a site, and they don't do wetland delineations most of the time. That's a different study that's done if you do have wetlands on site, to make sure that the Army Corps is satisfied with whatever you're going to put on the site. But they can look at it, and they know the area really, really well. And they can tell you if you're in a good spot to build on, or if you're in an area that they know of that you should avoid. I've had my soil scientists probably save me on 2 or 3 deals in the past month alone, where we sent them something that we thought looked good. And the GIS, the soil overlays that were done on our GIS were done probably in the 60s or 70s. So they're a little bit older, but he had been out there recently and he's like, don't look at this site. I know the soils look like they're good on GIS, but over time they've transitioned and moved, so they're not as usable as you may think. So those two are typically my starters that I go to and say, hey, what do you think about this? Does this site make sense or not? Now, when you get deeper into the entitlement process, there's a whole host of other people that you can bring into the picture, from geotech engineers, because you're trying to get boring samples on a site. You're going to bring in surveyors, different things like that. But right off the rip, those two can give you a really good insight into, are you on the right track, or should you just let this go and not pursue it at all?
I have a quick question there, Ben.
Yeah.
On those people on our team and the different studies that we're doing, are those builder responsibility for the cost of that? And then what on that 100-acre parcel, what would that look like? If you have an idea.
If we were to put them under contract and say, we're going to develop the site with that engineer and with that soil scientist, soil scientists to do a typical soil survey in our area, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 to get one done, depending on the size of it and how hard it is for them to get into those areas they're looking at. Engineer through preliminary approval in the entitlement process, and that's the first step, is getting it preliminary approved. Typically $15,000 to $25,000. If you get them to draw a sketch up for you, submit the drawings to the city or county, go to the TRC meeting, and then go to the hearing with the Board of Commissioners or the Planning Board or whoever you have to go to in your town or municipality. Typically 15 to 25, can be cheaper than that. And the only other thing I'll say at that stage, if you're going through that piece of it, you're going to need to get surveys done. Typically, you're going to need at least a boundary survey. Depending on the size of land, that can get expensive. It can be, anywhere from $5,000 up to $30,000 if it's a very large parcel. The next survey you'll need is a topo survey. That tells you the heights of the dirt and basically all the elevations. It verifies what's on GIS. But we don't typically get topos done until we're preliminary approved, just because we don't want to spend that money if we haven't at least got approval, the preliminary approval from the city or town that we're working with.
And I think just knowing that type of information is valuable as you have some of these smaller custom builders that say, hey, go find me 3 pieces of land, or go find me, find 10 acres for me, for you to at least understand that they understand what they're doing, versus the onesie twosie lots that they've built on. And like you said, the leftover lots from a subdivision that's already got infrastructure and that sort of thing, because those costs are hefty to get into that type of process. So thank you for sharing that.
That's a good point, Debbie, and I'm glad you said that. I'll qualify that with, if you're doing a really small subdivision, it won't be as expensive. So if you're talking a 5 or 10 lot development, which we would call a minor subdivision and not a major subdivision, those costs aren't nearly as large to do something along those lines, right? If you're doing anything larger than 10 lots, really, it starts getting more expensive. So if you're just doing a little 5 lot pocket development somewhere, not as bad. The cost will not be as bad.
Well, and I think too, it's important to know the process, because if we're going to prove ourselves valuable to a builder versus just an expense that they pay at the end, it's under, having those checks and balances on, confirming, did they meet with a civil engineer? Did they speak with a soil scientist? Have they done these different surveys? Just so you're speaking the same language that they are. It's no different than, us in residential real estate, where we understand the ins and outs. For us being at the coast, the CAMA permits and that sort of thing, we know the words to use. And getting into it and asking a custom builder to trust you and going to find land, you at least have to have the vocabulary for checks and balances for them too. That was my main thing too there. Yeah,
no, absolutely. The next piece of all of this, so once you get to that initial phase, right, it's what we then transition into the entitlement process. Entitlement process is simply the process of getting all of your approvals and then submitting CDs or construction drawings to the different authorities in your area, NCDOT, erosion control, stormwater, the planning board, and they're going to give you what they call feedback or comments on all of your submittals. Now, the entitlement process is one of the areas where, if you're talking to a landowner or you're talking to a builder, it's where you can bring the most value in getting them to adjust their expectations. beyond the price of the property, which is a whole separate conversation, right? It's the time. A lot of people go into these developments not understanding the time required. Now, I'll qualify this with a minor subdivision, again, shouldn't take as long. Most of the time, those can get turned around in less than 90 days. At least in our area, we see it be a pretty straightforward process. There's not as many requirements or stipulations on them. But when you get to these major subdivisions where you're trying to develop 20, 30 lots, 100 lots, 500 lots, there's a lot more steps you have to take just in terms of everybody making sure that the development is going to hit all the different points in the UDO, and that all the different authorities are satisfied with what you're putting out there. So a typical project, depending on complexity, if you're not doing a minor, we're talking a major subdivision, is around 9 to 12 months just for the entitlement process. That's pretty normal. And that includes you getting an initial sketch done, applying to the TRC and the planning board, going before them presenting, and from there you typically go to the Board of Commissioners, and they'll either approve you or deny your project. And then from there, you enter into the CD phase or the construction drawing phase. And that's where your civil engineer is working on drawing up the plans for the actual horizontal development of the subdivision. This typically, it used to take around 6 months to get to this process, but it's gotten so bogged down because you'll submit to, say, NCDOT, they have a review window of 30 to 60 days to get comments back to you on your CDs. And now it used to be you'd have 1 or 2 submittals. 2 submittals was kind of where we'd land at most of the time with our projects. Now we're seeing anywhere from 6, 7, 8, 9 submittals that we have to go through to get an actual set of CDs approved and get all of our permits in order. So a simple project, a normal project, I would say, 9 to 12 months is what we typically tell our sellers to prepare for. If it's a really complex sewer project that involves things like a pump station, multiple turn lanes, all those different amenities that they may want inside of that development, we're budgeting out anywhere from 2 to 5 years just to get through our entitlement process. That's not including the horizontal construction of the subdivision.
Wow. Wow. Think about timelines for, I know different areas on the call. For us, not a lot of land here at the coast, so small pockets. I know I shared one with you, I think yesterday or day before, 30 unit community coming up, because we are dealing with smaller pockets of leftover land. What does that look like for timeline, if you have just an estimate? Because I know every area is going to be different.
30 lot, depending on, is it water sewer?
Yeah, municipal.
So water sewer. I would say entitlements anywhere from 12 to 18 months is what I would anticipate. Depending on how restrictive they are. We have certain municipalities, and I'm sure everybody on this call, you can probably name certain municipalities that are easier to deal with than others. So we have a few that we know going into it's going to be a bloodbath. We're like, we know we're going to be here for 3 years getting this thing approved. Whereas other municipalities, we go in and we're actually moving at the 6 to 9 month pace. So I think that's it's really hit or miss on which municipalities you're working in. The other thing that we've noticed is, and again, this is just a side note, we don't have to get into it today, is that the land development process is pretty political. So one of my big suggestions to anybody on the call is if you're going down this path, go make friends with your town planner, go make friends with your commissioners. Not so much that you're trying to, turn their opinion, but you can at least have conversations if something goes sideways. And it's not if, it's when. It's when something doesn't work, you can pick a phone up and say, hey, what happened? Give me some insight. Because there's one thing they're going to present at a board meeting in front of everybody, and there's always conversations happening behind closed doors. And I can tell you personally, we've had several projects that were not working out on the front end, and we were able to have some backdoor conversations and figure out what they wanted. In one case, it was they wanted a better amenity center, right? We could have done that if we had known that up front, but they couldn't tell us that directly. So we went and improved the amenity center. We got the project approved. So there's things like that you can do that will be super helpful to any of your sellers if you have those connections in place already, where you'll also have a temperature on, are they approving projects or not? If you have a piece of land in your municipality and you know those commissioners are getting close to putting a moratorium on something, then you can advise that seller much better than someone who doesn't have those relationships. So I think it's key that you have the proper relationships in this as well. When you're talking about key people on your team, I would say anybody who works in the municipality in the government sector that you're looking to bring a piece of land in or develop some houses in, be friendly with those people.
Yeah, and that's a true example of how we can look at the immediate impacts of new construction on our inventory levels, right? If we're taking 9 to 12 months to get to point A, that new, people say, well, why aren't these builders building? Well, there's all of these steps that we're having to go through to get there. So
Yeah.
I have plenty of questions. Keep going with where you are, though.
Okay. So after you get it fully entitled, you're now at a juncture where if you're working with a landowner or with a developer, you can do something called selling paper lots, right? So we talked about VDLs earlier, vacant developed lots. Now you have what's called paper lots. And that means that you have a development that is basically permitted, ready to go, and can start horizontal construction. There is a value to this. The value tends to be a little bit more nebulous than the value on an actual lot. Back about a year ago, paper lots were selling at an extremely high rate because it's so hard to get through approvals. Now you're not seeing as much of that because a lot of the capital markets and liquidity have been frozen due to the interest rate hike. So it's actually harder to get an A&D loan right now to do a full-on horizontal development. There are people still developing projects who have the capital or have the investor relationships, and they're putting together the different funds to do those. But most of the time, if you sell paper lots, you're going to sell them a little bit more than what the raw land is worth, but they're not trading nearly as high as they were about a year and a half ago. So after you have your fully entitled lots, you have paper lots now. Now you go to the horizontal development process. This typically takes 6 to 12 months, depending on the size and complexity of the project. If you're doing 100 to 150 unit project and it's a sewer water community, then you're typically looking around 12 months, depending on all the different infrastructure they want in the neighborhood. Bigger projects, of course, take more time and they're typically phased out. So you may have one that's 500 units, but you may only develop the first 150 within that first year, get all the main infrastructure into the neighborhood, and then phase out the next several groupings of lots, depending on what you have to do. And again, sewer projects are a little bit more complex. We're seeing more regulations being put on sewer projects because, again, the density is tighter, so there's more you have to do with it in terms of stormwater drainage and everything else. Septic projects, we're typically seeing septic projects take around 6 months for us to develop. They tend to move pretty quickly. And then from there, you're done your horizontal construction. Now you're talking about lot sales to builders. This is where, again, you guys can help bring value to your local builders or your regional builders, depending on who you're working with. And if you're advising a person who's selling land as well, they do something called takedowns. Larger national builders have the ability to buy more lots than local or regional builders. And why that's important is because the developer is looking to get their money back as quickly as possible. So if you have that 100-acre tract of land that we developed into, say, 60 lots, we want to sell all 60 lots at one time. We don't want a takedown schedule. Now, your local and regional builders, again, this is where you can bring values. If you find a developer and you're able to help a local builder negotiate a takedown schedule, that is immensely valuable for them, right? And there's some developers who are willing to do that if the price of the lots is right and if you put up a big enough deposit for them. They'll typically want a larger first takedown to help take out some of their funds or help pay them back if they took a loan out to finance the project. But that's a really good area for agents to help their builder partners is if you find a development to help negotiate a takedown schedule. And then the other thing I would say on that is if you find a 30 to 50 or 60 lot neighborhood for your local builders, you can also coordinate several builders to come in together and buy more lots, which then makes the developer happy and they're more likely to work with you. That's one way we were able to help when I was doing the new construction side of the business. That's how I beat out a lot of our national competitors. They would always offer more money and they could always offer a takedown. I couldn't match that just because we didn't have the capital that they have access to. However, I could go to 3 or 4 or 5 of my local builder partners in the area around me and say, you know what? We're competitors. However, this is a great subdivision. If you take, 25% of the first lots and you take 25%, I'll take the other 50%. And then we're able to buy it at the price of the national builder in a takedown schedule that's advantageous to the developer. And again, that's a deal that we were able to work out several times. I had agents come to the table and bring their builder to the table and they were able to coordinate the sales in the neighborhood for themselves. We had our own sales team working for our new construction firm, but they were able to get the sales on their builder lots for themselves. So that's another angle that you guys can help your builder partners, is combining some of them and making sure, again, you want to make sure you have marketing agreements in place and making sure that you're not cut out of the deal. But at the same time, it's a great way for you to get them access to lots that they would otherwise not have access to. Okay. I've talked a lot, Debbie. What questions do we have?
Well, yeah, I've got, you guys go ahead and take a minute and pop some questions in there based on what you've heard so far. The additional topics that I have that I'd love to have you dive into, some of the things that we've talked about in the past, are some of those pay points where we as agents through this process can make ourselves more valuable and be paid more than on the here's the lots, here we'll go sell the house, like you said, covering your opportunity. The other thing is the question on farmer. How do we become part of that large parcel sale? So I know some of the guests on the call today are in more rural areas. So farmer to farmer sales or farmer to builder, developer, that sort of thing. How do we make ourselves, or who do we need to know to make ourselves that intermediary between the sales of those properties and bring those developments to our local area? So those are two that I had pressing. And let's see, what else do we have here? I'll let you start and I'll scroll through here.
Okay, perfect. So for inserting yourself on sales of large tracts of land with farmers or whoever it may be, the most success that I have had, I actually have a deal that's going to start construction in June with a local farmer, and he was looking at selling to another farmer. So this is a live case action that worked for us. First thing I did was build a relationship with them. So we didn't just go in and say, hey, we just want to develop your land. I'm not interested in what happens to you. We went in, and his name's Mr. Kelly. And I said, Mr. Kelly, what's your goal here? He had some kids who didn't want to take over the farm. He's older. So we sat down and figured out what his game plan was. And really it was maximizing the dollars of that land. And when we talked through it, it was pretty clear that once I put the numbers on paper for him, it didn't make sense for him to sell to another farmer. That was not going to maximize his dollars at the end of the day. What he had to accept or give me the okay on was the timeline. So this was a sewer and water community. It was a pretty large tract of land. So it took us about 2 years to get through entitlements. But what we did to compensate him for that was, one, gave him a very healthy price on the raw land so that he felt secure in the deal. And the second piece of that was we were able to work him into the final deal itself. So we put up a fund and we were able to put together a way for him to participate in that and get some of the upside. If you weren't putting together a fund, one thing I've done with other farmers that had worked really well is I gave them a contract and said, here's what I'll pay you for your raw land because I think I can get 50 lots out of it. But if I get 60 lots out of it, I'll pay you this additional money for it. So there's more upside for you to work with me than to sell this to another farmer who's only going to give you X dollars based on the acreage or the yield that they believe they can get from the farm itself. So the biggest advice I can give there is to learn what their end goals are and work with them towards those end goals. And most of the time, they're trying to maximize the dollars of the land itself. And right now, there's not a better way, and they know this. Again, farmers are I would say some of the more intelligent people that I work with. I work with a lot of attorneys. Let me tell you, I like the farmers a lot better. But they're very, very intelligent, shrewd people. And they're also my favorite because they're very pragmatic. So at the end of the day, if I know they're trying to make the most money for their land, there's not many ways, unless it's zoned commercial, that they're going to make more money than a residential development. So breaking those numbers out, showing them how you can help them achieve those goals and the process overall, it's extremely helpful. We've had a good amount of success with that in our area. Okay. Pay points. Is that what's next?
Yeah, let's talk about how we get paid. Hey, there's another country song that says dirt like that don't come that cheap. So you can Google that one as well. See, all these songs come into mind. Pay points. How do we make our money?
All these country songs. You can tell you're a Georgia Bulldog fan just by the country songs.
Yes.
Okay. So the different pay points, this is an area I think agents tend to miss on, and it's not any fault of the agents themselves. We just get so locked into selling houses that we don't think about in new construction different ways to get paid. And I'm not gonna lie, I was guilty of this for a long time. And as I stepped more into this world, there's different ways for you to make money besides just getting a commission on the sale of the house. So the first pay point is finding the land, right? There's if it's not listed, you can list it, you can get a commission on it. You can get a commission if you give it to a commercial agent. My suggestion is another one person in your key team, if you're building out that key team, is find a good land commercial agent in your area. They're worth their weight in gold just from a knowledge standpoint. There's only a few of them out there. In general, there's a lot of commercial agents who generalize and they do a lot of different things. There's not a ton that know land really well. So I would say find yourself a commercial agent and get a referral fee. And then you can also put the land under contract and wholesale it if you wanted to a developer or assignment of contract. Now I know wholesale is kind of a funky thing and not a lot of agents love it. But in the land world, it's not abnormal to get a piece of land under contract and then take it to a developer who they don't do as much lead generation in terms of finding parcels, but they're looking for land all the time to develop. So you can take to them and make an assignment fee. Now, if you do that, unless you can negotiate a marketing agreement or something with them for further down the line, it kind of dies right there. But that's the first area you can make money is finding the land itself. The second area is managing the entitlements, right? Now this gets a little bit more into the weeds if you're helping someone, but what we've done in the past, and we do this now at Rock Tower, is there are times where we're dealing with a landowner who wants to develop the land, but they have no clue about the process. So they come to us and they say, well, can you help us manage it, right? We don't have the time or the ability to coordinate with the engineer, the surveyor, the geotech, the get a phase one ESA, all these different things that need to be done. They'll pay for it, but we just want you to manage it for us. Well, you can charge a fee for that, right? Going to the planning meetings, scheduling the project, helping them make sure the invoices make sure were completed properly. So after you find the land, you can help manage, and we just call that a management fee, right? So you can get paid at that point as well. It's not abnormal. The third area that you can work in is if you're working with a local builder and if they don't have the capital to do a development on their own, is finding them the investors, right? So there's three really big areas that you can go and find investors. The first is just a traditional bank. If you wanted to try traditional banks, they're not really financing A&D loans as much anymore. They're all real skittish about commercial real estate. So the second area would be private equity. These guys are a little bit looser than a bank. They're still pretty stringent and difficult to work with. However, if you were able to connect one with your builder, they're a good source for larger projects. And then the third one would be investor groups. Now, most of you guys have investors and you have different groups of people in your sphere that passively invest money in things, right? And you can set up an investment group, a limited partnership, and help put together essentially the fund to pay for the development itself. And to do all that, you can typically get a fee for managing all that. Again, this is just a management fee for managing the whole process. The fourth pay point would be selling the lots. I've seen a lot of agents get hung up on this because they want to be a part of the sale of the house. For me, I would rather eat my cake right now than 3 years from now person. So a lot of times they'll balk at selling to a national or regional builder. My suggestion to you is look at it from the angle of what's your total commission amount that it would be on the total development. So let's go back to our, say, 60 lot development. If you were going to make a 2.5%, 3% commission, I don't know what y'all are charging for them, but say it's somewhere in that range, you can work out the math on what you're leaving on the table, hypothetically, if you don't sell those houses. And you can back that into a fee charged to sell it to a national builder. Now, why would it be valuable to have an agent involved when you're selling to a national builder? It's a lot of contract negotiation. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of organization. It's a lot of what you guys do when you go to sell a house. It's just at a whole different level in terms of the documentation involved. So it would be valuable when you're selling the lots if someone was trying to sell them, that you're involved at that point. We've done it where we pay a certain fee to agents that gets them their money sooner rather than later. It can be a per lot fee. It can be a total amount on the total transaction. It just it's different for every single person. But then you can also negotiate a marketing agreement with your builder at that point as well, and that's where you go to the sale of the houses. Now, my suggestion is if you're going to be the agent on these houses, I would work in that marketing agreement whenever you find the land or whenever you bring that builder into the picture. I wouldn't wait until you get all the way through the contract phase. They're getting ready to purchase the lots, and then you go, hey, let's sign my listing agreement now or my marketing agreement now. I would do that at the onset and say, hey, I'm bringing you these lots, but we got to sign a marketing agreement that says I get to list them and sell them whenever it's time. Or I get paid a fee since I won't be able to list them or sell them. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah. Lots of opportunity there that I'm sure some of us, I know for me, have left on the table for sure.
Yeah.
Keen has a question here. Up to conversions with soil scientists, will you have to put the site under contract and negotiate a due diligence period?
Not just for a conversation. If you're sending anybody on site to do investigation work, yes, you would need to have it under contract to do that. And typically, at least in the land world where I'm at, it may be different in other markets. We have a feasibility period. They call it a bunch of different things: feasibility period, investigation period, entitlement period. There's all these different names for it. Basically means the amount of time that you're allowed to look at the property, but then you can walk away from it without paying additional deposits or having to purchase the land or being in breach of contract. Those time periods typically run anywhere from 90 to 120 days. We try to give ourselves 3 to 4 months to get our early studies done and get it before the planning board to see if the project is feasible or not. The main thing I'm always shooting for is preliminary approval in 90 days or less. And to do that, you have to line things up pretty quickly. But if you're preliminary approved, that's a good sign that you can at least take this through to the paper lot phase. So to answer the question, yes, if you're going on site, you would need to have a contract and an investigation period. But if you're just wanting them to take a look at it on GIS, you can call a soil scientist and they should be able to answer your questions.
Another question Megan had is the landowner paying for the entitlement process?
Good question. It depends. So it'll depend on if they want to be a part of it. It depends on what they're going to charge as their sale price when they go to sell the land. We've had some landowners, they do some preliminary studies on it. They'll get a survey done. They'll get a preliminary soil study done or analysis done on the property. Things like that, or they'll take it to an engineer and they'll pay him $1,000 and he'll give them a sketch of what could happen on the property, right? It's all very preliminary. It's very speculative, but they can do that. If they want to go further in the process, it's not abnormal, just depending on how savvy they are. I would say, going back to like Mr. Kelly, he has done a fair amount of real estate transactions. He's never done land development, which is why we got connected, was to help him through the whole land development process itself. So I think it will really depend on how savvy they are and if they've done it before. If it's a family-owned estate type thing, most likely not. They're not going to pay for that stuff. That would be on the buyer to pay for those items.
Great. Thank you. One more from Adam. Can a broker help with showing what home price points are needed in the current market, and how does that home price affect the development planning process?
That's a really good question. Yes. So one of the big value points that agents can bring to the table for developers, landowners, and on the new construction side of things is a CMA, comparative market analysis. And most of your builders, they don't do any type of forecasting in terms of what they think home prices will be in 5 years and then base their purchase of the land off of that. They're going to go off of what the home prices are today. So and the simple formula that a lot of them use, just so you guys can jot this down in your notes, is they want to pay for their finished lot. They want to pay between 15 and 30% of the sale price of the home. So if you're looking at a $400,000 sale price on a home, 30% would be a $120,000 lot. 15% would be around that $60,000 range, right? So that's what they're willing. And I see most builders landing in that 25% range. A lot of them don't like pushing the 30% to justify their lot price. Again, local builders aren't able to pay as much as national builders. National builders will pay you a premium because they do not want to have land or land debt on their books. They would prefer to be what they call land light. That's the model that most of your nationals are running these days. So they're willing to pay a premium above what the market is paying to not have that land or those lots on their books until they absolutely need them for their runway. Which again is why it's nicer to work with the nationals at that scale, but the locals are better because if you have a problem, you can go find the local builder and knock on their door versus the nationals, you're kind of up a creek. So there is risk or pros and cons to each one. But absolutely, knowing your home sale price is what a lot of them base their land books off of. And that's how they get approval through their land committees, is by backing in from the actual sale price of the homes.
Yeah, I love that. So, sticking with some of the questions, I know you and I talked about the buyer consultation, seller consultation that we're familiar with in residential sales. When you think about, for us locally, so we may have some custom home builders that are looking to pick up lots that would reach out and say, "Hey, I'm looking for some lots. If you help me find the lot, I'll let you list the house." And I think most people would go, "Yes, I'll go find it." But what questions should we be asking of those builders as a consultative piece to know exactly what they're looking for?
Yeah, it's a great question. I go back to how, and I know this is such a tired question, Debbie, and I hate even saying it, but I'm going to say it. How are you bringing value to your local builders? How do you bring value to a builder? It's more than just selling the house, right? So one of my favorite things to do is learning their process. And what I mean by that is sit down with them and figure out, how do they build a house? Learn the different pieces of how a house is built, but also how they do it. Everybody does it a little bit differently. The process is the same overall, right? You get a foundation, and then you're going to your framing, then you're going to roofing, and then you're going to your siding, and then you do drywall, then you're yada yada yada. It's all very much the same format, but they may have different ways of how they want to sell that home to someone. So I always ask, are they more spec driven or spec homes, inventory homes, or do they prefer pre-sales? If they do a pre-sale, how do they do it? Do they want you to go to the design appointment? Are they at the design appointment? Do they have a design center they want you to go to? Do they have packages put together? Could you help them put together packages so that they could make it easier for themselves to sell a home? That's a really big value add for agents. You guys are in homes all the time, and you're always seeing what's in trend or in style right now. It'd be great if you could walk into a custom home builder and say, "Hey, here are the packages that you can offer as a base offering, and then we can add whatever else the buyers may want on top of this." The other part is, how many times do they want to meet with the homeowners? This is a big piece that people don't think about. Most production builders have a schedule, right? They say, these are the meetings you're going to have with us. It's on these time frames. Here's a lot walk before we break ground on your house. There's a pre-drywall walk where you can come in. You can have an inspection done. Most of the time in our area, you can have the inspection, but they're not going to fix anything beyond what the code requires, the building code. And then you'll have your blue tape, and then you have your final walkthrough and your acceptance walkthrough. And what we tend to see is agents show up at that blue tape walkthrough and they skip all the other pieces, right? If you have a local builder, they may not have this process at all. So they may appreciate, you being kind of the barrier of entry to their product, and say, every time a client wants to come meet us, they have to call me first to schedule an appointment, and then I'll let you know that we're going to be on site. They don't want their subs or their trades getting messed up by having buyers walk through the house when they're not supposed to be there. So that's a big thing, is figuring out how many times do they want to meet with the homeowner, when do they want to meet with the homeowner, and if they don't have that process, can you help set that process up for them? And then another key component is contracts. A lot of agents and builders, I would say there's a pretty big split here between the nationals. They all have their own contract. I bet everyone on this call has experience selling one of those houses and getting that 60-page to 80-page monstrosity that's just full of all this legalese, right? I would say, instead of pushing against those contracts, is lean into them, learn them better than the agents that are there at the site. I always look at it as, if this is the playing field that we have to be on, then I want my clients to be represented as well as they can be represented, which means I should know this contract inside and out. So my suggestion on that would be, if you're working in a certain area and you have, say, 5 national builders that sell the majority of homes, or you want to sell their homes, or regional builders, whoever it may be, go get their contracts and read them and learn them. Learn the ins and outs of the warranty process. Learn the ins and outs of their walks and where their outs are on the contract. So you're super prepared, and you become that new construction agent of choice, by the way, because you actually know the process and you know their contracts. But for your local builders, most of them use a very standard North Carolina realtor form, right? So maybe we do something where it's a blend, and you help them create some more of a custom contract for that builder. Maybe it's not as robust as a national builder, but it's a little bit tapered down, but it's still unique to that builder that you help them create. Again, that's a big value add, because builders at the end of the day, most of them just want to build a house, sell the product, and move on. I think it's a challenge when they have to delve into the transactional side of things, or the contract pieces. Other things are like, what incentives do they offer? Do you guys help with the incentives, help them structure what incentives are moving the market? At one point, there were no incentives when 2020, 2021 hit, right? It was, hey, here's a house. If you want it, you're going to pay us $50,000 above market for it, or it's gone. I'll go to the next buyer in my queue. That shifted into higher commission amounts being offered to buyer agents, and then these massive incentives being offered to homeowners. Do you understand the incentive process enough? Is it better to do closing costs? Is it better to do a rate buy down, a 2-1 buy down? Helping your local builders understand that to help get their homes sold, because the nationals are going to do it and you're competing. How are you helping them get their homes sold? And then the last piece is, I'll say last 2 pieces is what's their build cycle and timeline, so that you have an understanding of how to set expectations with buyers. One of the biggest things that we saw people miss on was, we would tell an agent when we were doing new construction, here is the timeline that we expect for the home. However, material shortages and delays, trades may not show up. We think it's going to be 9 months, could be 12 months. They would go back and tell their client that it's going to be 9 months on the dot, right? So communicating and learning your builder's timeline and build cycle, and then actually going out there every week to look at the house yourself, just to see where it's at and to see if something got stalled or delayed. That's a big communication piece between your builder and yourself, but then also for your client. And at the end of the day, you have to envision yourself as being the buffer between your builder and the client. That's your role, right? So you don't want your buyer being out there every single week and then calling the builder directly and saying, hey, I went by the house and nobody's working on my house. And it's like, well, that's because I talked to the builder and this is what's going on. The windows are delayed. They broke a window, something happened that you already know about, and you communicate to your buyer feels like you're on top of it. Your builder feels like you're on top of it, because they're not being harassed by the buyer. It's a win-win in all parties, and you look like the hero in the whole thing because you've got the communication right. So knowing the build cycle and timeline is huge. And then the last piece, and this leads back into the land development side of it, how many deals, lot purchases, and takedowns can your builder support in a calendar year? That's a big piece that people don't talk to their builders about, is how many deals do you need in your runway? How many lots do you currently own, or do you need to own? How many deals do you want to, or how many houses do you want to build this year? And you can help them project out their runway for the next 2 years, which is I would say, a really big value add as an agent for a builder.
That's great. And those are all ways that'll make us better. Like you said, visiting the home once a week, or however the cadence that you have available, staying on top of this, that makes you a better, more marketable agent when you are in front of these local builders. And the other thing is understanding the big box builder contracts. They, as we all know, they've built in ways to make more money. And so taking some of those and saying, okay, Mr. Local Builder, have you thought about this? Because I see it in XYZ's contract every time I review them. I think that's important. Keen did have one question, so I'll have you circle back on that. He asked, and he just hopped off, so he asked for walking back through the projection. So if someone else has that question, throw it back in the queue. Otherwise, we'll just continue to move on so we can get you out of here on time. And any other questions as we've been talking? What are some other questions that you have for me? I'd like to know, where do I go find investors? Like you said, there's some private equity funds. We know investors that are out there. Where would I go find additional investors if I'm working on some type of project like this?
Yeah, good question. I would say to start with is your sphere. Just figure out you'll be surprised at who your investors are in your sphere. And I always go in with not that I'm trying to get that person to invest or put money into a fund with us. It's who do they know? And it gives me the opportunity, one, to sharpen my skills on talking about the opportunity that we're working on. But two, they'll typically be more interested if they don't think you're trying to sell directly to them. But I always start with my sphere and just talking to people in general, and saying, we're setting up this fund for land development. Here's what we're trying to do: purchase land and hold it, land bank it, and here's what we intend to do with it down the road. And I would say I'm the most surprised at how many people in my sphere, but also just in general, from what I've heard from other people doing land development, is how many of them have said there are several people around you that are doing these deals already that you don't even know about. There's one group I'm talking to right now, and they were heavily involved in land development back in 2004 and 5, got out during the recession, and they've been looking to get back into it for the past 3 or 4 years. They just haven't had an opportunity yet. So we brought them something, and they were willing to get back into it. So I start local, like with my own personal sphere. And then from there, I start branching out to the people that have contact with the people who have the money, right? So talk to your attorneys, talk to your wealth managers that you may know. And if you don't know any, go make friends with some. They're great people to have, not just from a capital investment standpoint, but those people buy houses too, and they sell houses too, and they know people who buy and sell houses. So I always tap those areas of where is the money at, and then I go and try to make friends in those areas and make the connections there. And it'll serve both purposes. It'll help you set up the fund itself, and it'll also help you potentially pick up some real estate deals along the way. And then as for private equity or any of those, you can scatter, you can shotgun the approach. Talk to a bunch of private equity firms. You really want to be sure you're talking to one that deals in land and lot development, not just commercial real estate. There's 4 or 5 that we deal with that know it really, really well. And then there's a lot of Wall Street groups out there who are more looking at the build for rent space, and they don't understand the land development side of it as well. So they're willing to buy a finished product from somebody, and they'll tell you they're in the real estate space, but they don't really deal with land development. They don't understand the risks that are associated with. So just be mindful of that you're not going down kind of a bunny trail and hunting something that isn't going to pan out for you on that front. But they're usually publicly listed. You can find lists of private equity investors and put them together and talk through them. They're a little bit more tedious. They have instead of your local investor group who will sign, we have an LP agreement, limited partner agreement that people sign. A little bit less strings attached to that than there is with a private equity or a bank at the other end of the spectrum, as you can imagine. They're all about risk mitigation and how do they hold you accountable on collateral and personal guarantees and all that kind of stuff. So it's just where you want to play it on the playing field. But also, I'd say the deal size that you're dealing with. If it's a little 10-lot pocket development, most likely private equity or a bank isn't really going to be interested in that. It's not large enough for them to make any money off of. Because at the end of the day, everybody's trying to make money off these deals. So you have to make sure that the deal itself is appetizing enough for them to make money off of. As a side note on that, the margins on these projects, just in case you guys wanted some numbers, is typically land developers want to be between a 25 and 35% gross margin. They don't want to see anything less than a 15% IRR or internal rate of return. That's just telling you how fast they get their money back. So those are the 2 big metrics they look at. And then ROIC, return on investment capital. They do that on an annualized basis, meaning that they look at the return on an annual return versus it being a total gross amount. We're normally seeing them want to be anywhere from 15 to 25% on ROIC. Just rough numbers. It varies for every person. Sometimes they're higher, sometimes they're lower. Sometimes they'll eat a lower gross margin for a higher IRR. All of that just differs with whoever you're dealing with.
Great. And this ties to that. So Adam asks, if you're budgeting a development project, what contingency or margin of error do you plan for? And do different investors have different requirements for this?
Good question. Yes, we do. We always put a contingency in there because it's not if you use it, it's when you use it. Things will go wrong and somebody will make a mistake. And I just had a $50,000 change order come through for some drainage pipe that wasn't included. So it happens all the time. It's very normal. So for me, it's all about where am I at in the project. So my preliminary budget that I do at the very beginning of a project, I'll put in 15% of my construction costs as my contingency. As I get further along and I get better QTOs or quantity takeoffs from my engineer to give to my contractors and I get firmer numbers, I'll dial that down by the end. We're usually at about a 5% contingency. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're dealing with most of our projects are between $2 million and $10 million on the construction side of things. It's usually a pretty decent buffer that you have in there. And when you get to your final QTO, those numbers are normally pretty tight. There's not a lot of room left in there for them to miss stuff on the plans. The contingency typically kicks in when the county or somebody comes out to inspect it and they want more something added to the project. Like on this one I just mentioned, they wanted more drain pipe added to it and they wanted to upsize 2 of the pipes from a 12 to a 15-inch culvert. So that stuff happens and you just have to kind of eat it to get approvals done, but you budget into the project.
Great. All right, well, I'm going to have everyone on the call take a second and either throw an extra question in the chat box or something that you learned from today that you can take away into your business. And while they're doing that, Ben, what additional nugget would you give our listeners on land development and acquisition in order to secure additional business in the future?
I think one of the tenets I've lived by is don't be greedy, and not calling anybody greedy. It's just easy to get into these deals and start seeing the dollar signs and trying to figure out how do I keep it all for myself. My approach was how do I give most of this away to other people so that I can accelerate the growth so that because I know the dollar will come later on. So when you go into a deal, to me, it's always I'd rather have half a watermelon than a whole grape. So I'm not afraid to bring people in. I'm not afraid to bring different investors in or different engineers in, pay people the money to be paid so that we can succeed in the deal. So I would say that's one of the big things I see people tend to miss on, especially agents who have never done a land deal before. They kind of grab onto it and they hold onto it and they're like, I'm not going to share any of it with anybody. And it's like, well, if you share it, you'll get more deals down the road and you'll be able to move faster on it. And in this game, speed is almost as important as the money. I can't tell you how many times I've given up dollars so that we could go faster on a project, which in the end allowed me to do more projects, which ended up getting me more dollars, if that makes sense. So I would say don't be greedy. Be willing to bring people in sooner rather than later. If you get stuck on something, reach out for help. A lot of this is experience and people who have been there and seen it before. So bring people in sooner rather than later.
Great. All right. Now I know you all learned something, so I'd love to hear from at least 2 of you, something you learned to apply to your business. I learned a ton just with the different steps that we need to make sure we follow. I know you and I have spoken in the past about different land development opportunities. Extremely valuable for me. How long have you been doing this, Ben? Like, I feel like I've got a lot to learn.
Yeah. So 3.5 years. That's it. And it sounds like and 3.5 years sounds like a long time, but when it comes to learning all this, it's not as complicated as it sounds. You'll pick stuff up from a deal that you'll carry to the next deal to the next deal. That's why for me, it was more important to be able to touch as many deals as I could or be involved as many as I could, because then it gives you more experience. And then that experience compounds if you pursue it. So I would say it sounds like a big learning curve, but it's really not. It's just being mindful and getting the right mentors involved with you. And then you can accelerate it pretty quickly.
Educationally, are there some avenues that we should pursue to grow our knowledge in this outside of this amazing webinar, masterclass?
Yes, I would say pay attention. If you have like a Triangle Business Journal, they always talk about commercial real estate. That's a good thing to stare at and read about. If you're a nerd like me, you'll read those soil surveys. It's going to help you really understand your land and your area. They are dry reading, so do it with a lot of caffeine in your system right before bedtime. But
of course they are. They're soil.
Yeah, but they're fantastic for helping you understand the layouts of your city or your county. You'll understand where the rocks are. I mean, it sounds nuts, but that's an important piece of the puzzle, is understanding the different areas and what types of soils are in those different areas and in the land around you. So I would say that's a good one to dig into. Your GIS is a fantastic tool. It gives you all this information. Different counties have better GISs than other, but they all operate pretty similarly, so that you can access this data. One tool I would say that you probably don't have access to directly, but I'm willing to bet if you go and make friends with some builders that are big builders, they do have access to it, but it's a fantastic tool. Is Zonda/Metro Study, Zonda. It is a fantastic tool. It gives you all this market data and information that is not inside of the MLS. So it's heavily focused on new construction and builders. And what they do is they hire old people, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They take retirees, they send them out to all the communities in the area, and they literally count the lots and the building stages by hand and then enter this data in for you every quarter so that you get the most accurate representation of how many vacant developed lots, how many future lots are out there in your community. So it's a fantastic tool that most national builders and regional builders have access to. A lot of your developers use it as well. And then the last free tool I'll say is your local government websites, planning board minutes. They give you a lot of information. You should go back and read some of the planning board minutes on project approvals. You'll see the questions they're asking the different developers. You'll see site plans, so you can stare at some site plans and understand, the layouts and how they laid out a subdivision and why they did it a certain way. You'll start understanding all the different talk about zoning and UDOs and things of that nature. So planning board minutes are a fantastic source of education if you ever want to learn what's going on. Plus, it keeps you in the know that if a landowner comes to you and says, hey, this development's happening up the road, you can actually know about it because you read it in the planning board minutes in that area.
Well, and as the North Carolina, I don't know for all states, but North Carolina requires you to, it's not that, it's what you should know. So if it was buried in some business journal article, well, then you should have known it, whether it's there or not. So it's just keeping you up to date with what you should know. Very good. Well, Cindy learned how to bring value to the builder. So she's all ready to go and take part in that. And I know she's already doing some land development, land purchases. And Adam says it's a lot of work. Partner with someone that knows it well. And that's why I tell Ben all the time, I just call Adam. So, I mean, if nothing else, send it to the person that knows and help them get there and negotiate yourself into the deal. I mean, that's key. So, Ben, I want to thank you so much for being here today. Don't hang up yet, guys. I want to show you the upcoming master classes that we have. But first of all, Ben, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being here today. Your wealth of knowledge for all that listen to this master class. I'm so glad to have you.